Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time before European colonization to the present. The startup National Museum of American Religion is working to build a museum in the nation's capital that will share the story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join our host, Chris Stevenson, for Season 2 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released on the first and third Mondays of each month on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Register for notifications on our website, www.storyofamericanreligion.org, under the Sign Up tab.
Food sustains physical life, and as such, it is of critical importance to each of us. Some in the country have an abundance, hunger, or food insecurity gnaws at others. In which group we find ourselves determines much of our current existence. What we eat also touches on other aspects of our lives besides need. Celebrations, emotional comfort, health, family traditions, and connections or breaking bread with others. For the purposes of this podcast series, we are, of course, interested in uncovering and understanding the connections between religion and food in the United States, what they are, what they mean, and their significance. To do another deep dive into just one aspect of this fascinating and meaningful subject area, we have as our guest Benjamin Zeller, Associate Professor of Religion and Chair of both Religion and Islamic World Studies at Lake Forest College. His research interests include religion in America, religion and culture, religion and science, and new religious movements. He is the author of Heaven's Gate, America's UFO Religion, and Prophets and Protons, New Religious Movements and Science in Late 20th-Century America. For our discussion today, we are looking at his chapter, Quasi-Religious American Foodways, the Cases of Vegetarianism and Locavorisim, from the book Religion, Food, and Eating in North America. I am confident that today's podcast will help all of us better understand what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, and we trust that, as a result, listeners will see how indispensable the idea of religious freedom as a governing principle is to the United States and its ability to fulfill its purposes in the world. We encourage our listeners to visit storyofamericanreligion.org and register for future podcast notifications under the Sign Up tab. Ben, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
First, and I think your answer here will help our listeners frame the discussion we're going to have. Why and how did you develop a scholarly interest in the intersection of food and religion? Give us that tale.
Sure. It's a great tale, actually. So it started, as you mentioned in the introduction, the kind introduction, my main area of research is the study of new religious movements. And I discovered through the study of new religious movements that food is often one of the primary ways that they engage in outreach and in service and in worship. The Hare Krishnas are probably the best example. And I remember encountering them on the Washington Mall when I was maybe 12 or 13, giving out free food. And I remember being confused. What is this religious group? What are they doing, giving out their literature and their food? And that stuck with me. Even though I studied other topics within new religious movements, food was always of interest. And then one year, it must have been, over a decade ago now, I was teaching a course on comparative religion, and the topic I chose was food. And I remember being asked by my department chair at the time, find something comparative. And many scholars of religion are wary of comparison because, of course, you end up, if you think of a Protestant topic, everything looks sort of Protestant. Pick a Jewish topic, everything looks sort of Jewish. So I really was very careful and chose food and eating because it's universal. And that really led me down the path of more intensively studying religion and food. The book that you mentioned that we're discussing today, my chapter out of it, came out of our work that I collaborated with some colleagues to edit that book together to really try to jumpstart a conversation among religious studies scholars about what we can say about religion and food in North America.
Okay. Well, that is a great tale. What's the So, just for our listeners, tell us the significance, just in a word or two or a sentence or two, of what you have found in this intersection. How significant should we view it as we listen here today?
I don't think you can separate food from religion and religion from food. I think they're absolutely integrated. I think that when you start looking at religion and food and the connections between them, you discover you can say a lot about personal and collective identity, about the relationship to larger groups, to insiders, to outsiders, to broader social forces, and to American culture. Uh,
Okay.
I think that it's a great way to get into the actual details of how religion is actually practiced on the ground, and not just what we read about in a text or see in an institution, what scholars would call lived religion.
Right, lived religion. Okay. Ben, the first words in your chapter are from someone you interviewed. Quote, "Food is my religion," close quote. How do we view food in religious terms?
So I think we have to separate it in terms of particular religions and then religious more broadly. Particular religions make all sorts of claims about particular foods. Probably most of our listeners, viewers are familiar with Jewish kashrut or kosher, maybe Muslim halal. So there are sort of formal religious codes about food. And there's also more informal religious practices involving food. There's a ritual. So within Christianity, of course, communion or Eucharist involves food on a real level. I mean, it's not symbolically. I mean, it's not very filling. It's not a full meal, but it's nevertheless food. It's consumption. So we could actually look at the world's religions and we could find all sorts of details. But at a broader level, when we talk about religion more broadly, what food gets at is it's what you're putting in your body. It becomes you. So religions have teachings about that. That's a deeply moral question about what becomes you, what goes into your body.
Mhm.
This is a place where religions broadly, pretty much every religion I can think of, engages deep moral questions, ethical questions, questions of value, but what ought to go into one's body or what not ought not to. How should it be produced? How should it be raised? How should it be slaughtered if it's alive? How should it be prepared? With whom shall one eat it or one ought not to eat it? All of these things deeply influence one's individual practice, but also one's communal identity, the sort of people you can eat with.
Okay. I appreciate that framing. That'll help us as we move forward as well. You write of the, quote, religion of Coca-Cola, close quote, very briefly. I'd never sort of seen that or read about that. Can you tell us more about this and perhaps some other examples of what you call quasi-religions, and also, as you do, explain to the listeners what you mean by quasi-religions?
Yeah. So that I'm riffing off of David Chittister there a bit. He wrote an essay about the religion of Coca-Cola and the way in which there's sort of a quasi-religious veneration of particular topics within American culture. So my approach to that is to recognize there are differences between what I would call real religions, religious groups which understand themselves as such, are recognized by other religions as such, are recognized by the IRS as such, and things which look and act like religion, but may not necessarily be seen as religious by everyone, and the practitioners of which may not say, this is my religion. So whether you do or don't like Catholicism or Orthodox Judaism or Sunni Islam or Vaishnavism, Hinduism, we recognize them as religions. So I call that religion. Quasi-religions are things which act like or look like religion. Things which seem to have some of the hallmarks of religion, things like ritual, things like community, things like moral values and teachings, things like conversion narratives. So we'll talk about them. So that's why I use quasi-religion as an analytic term to distinguish it from the groups which really are seen as religions by really all their adherents and by others as well.
Right. Could you give us a few other examples and no additional details except for perhaps the name of them, other quasi-religions?
Sure. Actually, Gary Latterman has a great book on this, and I forget the examples he gives. And food is not one of them, but I think he talks about sports and music. But to use music as an example, we could talk about deadheads or parrot heads, people who follow particular musical groups as examples of sort of quasi-religions. So these are people who structure their lives around a particular group, Jimmy Buffett or the Grateful Dead for those examples. People who might travel to different concerts, they might wear particular particular clothing, purchase different paraphernalia, it might start to look quite a bit like some sort of veneration or like a pilgrimage. They may visit the graves of deceased members of the band. Here we could talk about Graceland and Elvis, for example. All of this might start to look very, very religious. But we're not saying someone is formally a member of the Church of Elvis or the Church of Jerry Garcia.
Right. Okay. Good. Okay, so now, Ben, let's talk about vegetarianism as a quasi-religion. You write that, quote, vegetarianism possesses strong analogs to religious practice, close quote. Tell us what you found and the significance of those findings for our listeners.
Yeah, so what vegetarianism has at its heart, which makes it look very religious to me, is a set of moral and ethical teachings that go along with practice. So at the heart of most religions are moral and ethical teachings. In fact, I've been told, and I've heard tell that people claim that the heart of all religions is a moral teaching. I think people have said to me, I think I've read this before, that all religions boil down to what we call the golden rule: do unto others as you would have done unto you. I think you can buy a T-shirt that has it from all the different religions on it. But that's the idea that religions have at their heart moral or ethical teachings. Vegetarianism does too. For most vegetarians that I interviewed, that I spoke with, the heart of their vegetarianism came down to a moral and ethical position. What is right to do versus what is wrong to do? What is aligned with the proper flow of the universe? What is disaligned with it? What is good with the capital G in a Platonic sense? What is wrong or evil in an ideal sense? These are moral teachings. These are teachings of value. And this is what we find in religion, and we find it in vegetarianism as well. Think about how worked up people get about what food is or is not appropriate to eat. The idea that eating a particular food is murder, for example, meat is murder, is sometimes, I think, a slogan I've seen vegans particularly make. That's a strong statement to say that it is murder. With it go all sorts of non-empirical claims that we see at the heart of many religions about what is the nature of a soul, what is the nature of what is right and wrong, what is the nature of consciousness, who has rights. All of those things get wrapped up. We could have the same conversation about, for example, abortion. What the nature of what is a human life, and where do rights begin and end. The same thing with vegetarianism. It's the idea that that animals have certain rights, and that is very religious or quasi-religious, we might want to say. Right. And then, of course, it becomes practice. It's about practice. It's about things you do. And that's what we see in all religions as well. Religions aren't just sets of values and teachings. They're not philosophies. I mean, they have philosophy at their core, but they're not just philosophies. Religions are put into practice. And that's where vegetarianism really looks like a religion, rather than just an abstract philosophy.
So when you interviewed these vegetarians, did you ever hear them talk in some ways about conflict between their vegetarianism and whatever formal religious traditions they had or still have? If it sounds very much religious, does it come into conflict for these people?
Yeah, that's interesting. So what I did as part of my my research, these were oral histories. So I would have a sort of a very small number of prompts we would start with. I really would try to let my interlocutors speak and tell their stories. And then after we've spoken for a while, I would tell them more about my research. And one of the things I would say is I'm interested, they would know I study religion, but I would say I'm interested in the way in which your practices can be compared to religion. And usually that would lead to a very nuanced conversations about just what you asked. I did have participants, interlocutors who did emphasize conflict, who would say my religion doesn't preach vegetarianism. It calls for omnivorism. This would generally be Christians. And my vegetarianism can be seen as in conflict with that. But by and large, most of the people I spoke with emphasized a continuity between their religious identities and their foodway identities, that their food practices aligned with the moral values which they drew from their religious identities.
Right. Okay.
In some ways, extending them.
Sure. Right. Some augmentation of some sort. Now we are going to move to a newer foodway, Ben, Locovorism. In this section, you explain that Locovorism possesses obvious religious parallels. Can you elaborate and include a definition as well?
Absolutely. So we have to set ourselves in time. We have to be a bit of a historically minded here. When I was doing this research, it was right after the publication of Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle, and Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma. Both of these books were by authors, well-known authors, who were pushing for what we come to call Locavorism. Locavorism is the idea that you ought to eat food which is produced locally. It's defined differently by different people, sometimes within 50 miles of where you live, sometimes within 100 miles. Sometimes it means it has to be brought on a truck and not on a train or a plane. Sometimes it's just exactly what you can produce, in your backyard. So there's varieties of locavorism. But the overall shared idea is that it is the right thing to do to eat food which is locally grown, and the wrong thing to do to eat food which is not locally grown. This is often based on ecological, environmental ideas, the idea that what we would today call a carbon footprint, but it often goes well beyond that, to sort of a spiritual connection to the land. That if you are rooted in a place, the right thing to do is to eat the material produced in that place. And it is wrong to align yourself with a different place. And this is a very sort of quasi-religious, almost spiritual idea that you are connected to the land somehow. Often the proponents of this often cite Native Americans or other groups that have more explicit teachings about being tied to the land.
Okay. Now you write in your chapter much more about this foodway than vegetarianism. Why is that?
Well, it was really taking off at the time I was doing this. And I think if I were to redo this research now, I'd probably go to vegetarianism, veganism. I'd probably go to gluten-free eating or sort of paleo right now. But at the time, locavorism was really taking off. And it was seen by many people as sort of a rising foodway, particularly where I was living in Southern Appalachia. This was tied to many of sort of the all this research was done in Southern Appalachia, basically near Asheville, North Carolina, if you know where that is. Mm-hmm. And there's a long history within Southern Appalachia of sort of the independence and the idea that Southern Appalachian folk want to live their own way and do their own thing. So I think it really connected with the identities of many of the people I was speaking with.
Right. Okay. Towards the end of this section, you state this: Locavorism certainly functions as a meaning of investing one's space with sacred meaning, which you briefly mentioned there, since it ties together ideas of life, death, meaning, and practice with reference to space. Can you give us a little bit more explanation here, Ben, of the broader significance?
Yeah, let me give you an example of that. So I remember doing one of these interviews, one of these oral histories in a garden. And it was a woman who I forgot how I found her. I think someone else referred me to her, but I had to drive up into, the valleys to find her. And she had a beautiful, small little home, but she had a gigantic garden. I think the garden was 2 or 3 times larger than her small little house. And she really wanted us to do the interview, the oral history out there. So we sat there, and as we would speak, she would refer to different parts of her garden. She would talk about her kohlrabi. She would talk about her broccoli. She would talk about the onions and the garlic that she was growing and saving. And it was so clear that so much of her identity and her day-to-day practice was tied up in the land and her connections to the land. It was no longer simply inert dirt. It was no longer simply acreage on a map. It had meaning for her. It was where she lived her life, and it's how she identified herself as someone who ate locally, ultra locally, as in her backyard. She tried to eat as much as she could, just food which she had grown. I remember she insisted when we were done with the oral history that I take some kohlrabi with me, which I actually had never had before. It's sort of a strange little vegetable if you haven't had it before. It looks like a flying saucer, sort of. But she, it looks like a Sputnik, actually. So she gave me a kohlrabi, and I remember her saying that when I tasted this, I would be tasting of the land, of her land. I'd be tasting of her effort. I'd be tasting of what she had put into it. And I don't think she was intentionally trying to sound like the Eucharist here, but there was a very Eucharistic sort of statement of this: eat of this, it is me. And that's, again, that's what I took from it. That in some ways this was tied up in her identity and her, and who she was. And I was taking communion effectively, to use a religious parallel of her and of the land. Now, again, we should say quasi-religious. She never claimed this literally was her,
right.
But it was symbolic.
Right. Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah. It was good kohlrabi too, I have to say.
Sure. I've never had it.
Yeah, it's
Sputnik.
Sort of like a cabbage crossed with something. I don't know.
Okay. But looks like Sputnik. That's what I should look for.
Sputnik, yeah.
We are talking with Benjamin Zeller, Associate Professor of Religion at Lake Forest College and author of the chapter Quasi-Religious American Foodways, The Cases of Vegetarianism, and Locavorism, in the edited book, Religion, Food, and Eating in North America. Ben, I want to get to the most interesting part of your chapter for me, and that is when you use religious conversion as a lens to better understand these quasi-religions. First, can you explain in layman's terms for our listeners what the two processes are that you mentioned in your chapter of religious conversion? And then we'll go into applying them to the two subjects.
Yeah, and this was fascinating to me too. I should say I didn't go into this research thinking that I was going to focus on conversion. I really just wanted to get the oral histories of the people involved. As I listened to them talk about their relationships with food, what I heard were conversion narratives. And conversion narratives can be structured in one of two ways. This is there's different models for how you can think about it, but the active or the passive conversion narrative is sort of one of the ways to think about it, and that's what I used in this chapter. So an active conversion is the idea that you're a seeker. You're seeking out. You recognize that the state you're in right now is wrong. You're seeking out something new, and that's an active conversion. I did hear a number of those people who said that they thought there was a problem with the way they were eating. It was making them unhealthy. It was making them unhappy. It was causing damage to the environment. It was disconnecting them from the land or from animals. So they were looking for something. And that's parallel to people who talk about religious conversion in terms of they weren't happy with what they were brought up. They were looking for something else. They were church shopping or shul shopping, or you went to different meditation centers. So that's one sort of approach to a conversion narrative. The other is the passive model. The passive model is a bit like Saul struck down on the road, right? The idea that you're not looking for it, and then out of nowhere you have this moment where things were going swimmingly, and then all of a sudden you're struck down and realize that everything you thought you knew was right is actually wrong. And I remember probably the most powerful of those stories that I heard, and I believe this is in the chapter as well, was a person who said they had to visit a slaughterhouse as part of a school field trip. And they had never thought about their food. They never thought intentionally about what they put in their mouth. For them, meat came from a package in a grocery store or a package they bought at McDonald's, and they put it in their mouth and they ate it and never thought about too much about it. When they went to a slaughterhouse, they had this realization that what meat was, that meat was dead animal, and that it was cut off the carcass of another living thing which had been killed for them to eat. And I remember this person I spoke with, I remember them saying that this was, they felt physically sick. They felt overwhelmed, and the next time they tried to eat meat, it tasted like poison to them. This is the idea that it happened to them. And I don't recall if it was this individual who said it to me or it was someone else who said something similar. I remember them saying they didn't want it to happen, that it caused impediments in their life. They didn't want to be vegetarian or vegan or locavore. This actually made life more difficult, but they felt as if they had to do it. They were ethically, morally drawn to it as the only way to live. And they would happily have gone on with their life and not lived this way if only they hadn't have had this experience. When I read that, I think a bit about some of Paul's letters and the way in which he talks about how this is, he didn't set out to become a Christian. For listeners who are not Christian, and so Saul is sort of a classic example of this.
Right.
That the idea of sort of this conversion, it happens to you.
Right. Okay. So was that story the story about Jessica that you just shared?
Maybe I use pseudonyms in the chapter.
Okay.
Okay. Right. There were 3 or 4 that were very, very similar. I didn't combine the stories, so each story is its own thing.
Okay.
But because I use pseudonyms, sometimes I forget who I matched up with.
Okay. So you just shared a story about a very detailed story about the passive model, right? This happened to her. Can you give us another example of that, and maybe some examples of the more active model?
Yeah. There was another interlocutor talked about study, talked about reading, and talked about spending years and years reading, thinking that there was a problem with the way he was eating. And he recognized there were environmental, ecological problems with the way he was eating. I believe this was the gentleman who referred to reading A Diet for a Small Planet. the idea that there's an ecological crisis with the eating of meat. And the eating of sort of particularly meat, which is produced in the insensitive way it is in terms of the land use. So he did a lot of reading about this. He read about what different religions taught about vegetarianism, and through all of his research, eventually, slowly, he came to embrace the idea of vegetarianism. This often was the story I heard from locavores as well. Locavores tended not to have that sort of spontaneous "it happened to me," but more the idea that they had encountered locavorism through the media, through reading, and that through reading about it, they decided this was a change they wanted to make in their life. In some ways, this gets back to the idea of print culture is so central to the American experience, right? Or the American quasi-religious experience. I think about David Hall's work, the great Puritan historian, talking about print culture in American religious history. So this is quasi-religious history, but it's the same idea. You read something and it convinces you. How wonderfully American, right?
Right, absolutely. Did you find any correlation between the quasi-religious foodway and the conversion process? Did one belong more to the other?
Yeah, I'm really so yes. The first answer is yes. That the vegetarians and vegans particularly tended to have more passive ways of describing their foodway conversions as compared to the locavores who had more active. However, I should be careful to say this is not a quantitative study. This was a qualitative study.
Absolutely.
I suspect if one were to do a quantitative study, one would find that followed through. But I don't want to make a claim that I can't. That's not justified.
Right.
I would also note something which is interesting, and again, because I did qualitative research, I can't really prove this, but I would guess surveys would support it. This sort of people who embrace these sort of all-encompassing intentional food practices tended to have less all-embracing, intensive, more conventional religious practices as well. People who were deeply dedicated to a particular religious identity tended not to then embrace some sort of new food identity as central to their lives as well. Again, it makes sense intuitively. If you're already deeply involved in some religious tradition, you're not going to be out looking for some new food practice, likely because your religious tradition already is giving you the moral, ethical teachings you need. I suspect this could be quantitatively demonstrated, but at least from my anecdotal evidence, it seems to connect.
Right. No, that does make sense.
It makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Did you find people that were very, very religious and at the same time a vegetarian or locavore?
Yeah, but the very, very religious, I think we have to sort of interrogate.
Sure.
Very, very religious in terms of emphasizing the teachings of Christ, the idea of caring for the poor and things like that, not necessarily in terms of frequent attendance at houses of worship or identity with a particular denomination.
Yep. Thanks for making that distinction. Right. Okay.
But yeah, there were plenty of people who said they were deeply religious.
Right.
Again, it seemed to me the sort of people who identified so closely with a particular community of practice were probably less drawn to these sort of foodway conversions because they already had other sort of centers of practice and identity in their lives.
Sure. And if we look at them as quasi-religions, it's hard just to create space in one's life for two. A quasi-religion and a religion, both of which take up energy and emotional space and physical doing. It would be hard to do both.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, I should actually note the exception would be people who had converted to Buddhism or Hinduism or something like that. A person who becomes a Buddhist and the sort of Buddhism that calls for vegetarianism, but then the vegetarianism was going along with the Buddhism. It wasn't necessarily a separate package. It was part of their broader religious identity.
Right.
But there were a few people like that who would sort of they got into sort of Buddhist practice, and that was connected to their vegetarianism.
Okay. At the end of the chapter, Ben, you write two things that need elaboration, I think, for our listeners. We've probably touched on some of it, but I'm going to ask you these questions anyways. First, and I'm quoting here, quote, "Becoming a vegetarian or a locavore is very much akin to a religious conversion, and this is because vegetarianism and locavorism are very much akin to religion," close quote. Would you elaborate a little bit on this?
One of the things that really struck me was when you have a religious conversion or a foodway conversion, it's not just changing a set of moral or ethical ideals about with one lives one's life. It affects who you're going to spend time with. If when you become a vegetarian, that's going to, and if you are deeply committed to vegetarianism or locavorism even more, that's going to limit your ability to share meals with people who do not share your new foodway practices. Just in the same way, when a person joins a new religious community, that's going to affect the social networks they're part of. I mean, social networks in the broad sense, not I don't mean Facebook here, but
Right.
the sort of the social groups one is part of. That these practices are deeply tied to community, and that we need to remember that while food is ultimately, the eating of food is an individual thing, it's also a communal thing. Just like religion on the one level is individual, it has to do with beliefs and things like that, but it's always practiced in communities. And that's something when I started to think about foodways as akin to religions, that's really something that came to the fore of my analysis, was that when we think about them as something like a religious conversion, some of the same questions you might ask of a religious convert, you can ask about a foodway convert. Did you find that you had to hang out with new people? Did you find yourself uncomfortable with people who are part of your old life? Did you feel as if you had to shun them, or you were being shunned? Did you feel as if you had to start a new life? Did you feel as if you wanted to move somewhere else and start over? Some of the same questions that one might ask a
Right.
religious convert, one could ask a foodway convert.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. The last sentence of your chapter, here's the second thing I'd like you to elaborate on. You write this, quote, like religious beliefs, practices, and membership in religious communities, beliefs, practices, and communities based on food help assuage anxiety and root people in space and society, close quote. Can you unpack this a bit? This is a heavy statement.
Yeah, and here I'm trying to sort of to step out of necessarily what my informants, what my interlocutors said about themselves, to try to think about how these practices were functioning for them. The idea that we live in a moment where food is a source of problems. And you started with this actually in the introduction. I think you mentioned, we live in a place where there's food deserts, where there's food abundance at the same time, where people are starving and people have deep problems with overeating and obesity simultaneously. There are problems with our foodway. Many of the people I spoke with referred to the standard American diet, as they called it, SAD or SAD. Sometimes they would just call it the SAD, the standard American diet. The idea that there's something sad about the way most of us are eating, there's something wrong with it. It was causing ultimately anxiety for many of the people I spoke with, that they felt uncomfortable, sometimes on a conscious, aware level. So the gentleman who was reading lots of books about it, but sometimes in retrospect, the people who had the more passive conversions, they would say, well, in retrospect, perhaps I was also anxious about it. I was never fully comfortable. This hadn't risen to the surface. I wasn't really aware the degree to which I was taking part in a foodway which was unhealthy for me and the environment, and unjust for animals or for plants or the land. All the foodways that these people are practicing help assuage in the text I wrote that anxiety, those concerns. People don't want to live under a shadow of anxiety. They don't want to live in such a way where they're uncomfortable with what they have to do every single day, which is eat. People want to be able to have meaning in their lives. And food practices are a central way of doing this, along with religion. And that's what I was getting at.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So you are a professor of religion. So I want to ask you here at the end, in conclusion, if you want to share any lessons or takeaways from the book, either the chapter in that book, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment.
It's a great question. Well, as I said, if I were to redo the research now, I think I would look at different groups, but I think I would still find some of the same basic ideas, which is that there are people who are on quasi-religious quests for meaning, and there are people who it just sort of happens to them. I suspect you could take the same basic tack to look at American religion more broadly. That you could trace a lineage of the seekers, people who have been looking for something new, something radical, something to disrupt their lives, and the people for whom it just happened to. But I think what I would take from that is I'd like to avoid simplistic narratives that simply say people were bamboozled, people were brainwashed, people were convinced, people were sort of forced, and the sort of the simultaneously equally problematic narratives of it's all free will, it's all choice. I choose this. Somewhere between those, the truth lies. Yes, we're all influenced. Yes, we're living in a place bombarded by different messages and religions and concepts, but we're all as individuals making our choices within the context of communities and other people, and avoiding simplistic ways to sort of boil it down, I think, is important.
Right. Okay. And I guess, Ben, I'll add one last question that I just thought of. If you can take a step back from sort of food and religion, and as a professor of religion, survey sort of religion in America over history from the beginning to present day, where do you put what you found? Where do you put your findings of the intersection of food and religion in this very broad, deep, and super significant part of American history? Where does it fit in?
I teach at Lake Forest College, where I teach a survey, American Religious Survey class. And one of the things I have my students do is I have them create their own meta narratives. I give them sort of I say, here's the narrative I want to focus on. And in some ways, for listeners who are familiar with American religious history, we're all sort of responding to Sidney Alstrom in certain ways, is it the Puritans or not? But then I ask my students to work with me to think about ways we can imagine American religious history. The challenges and the growth of diversity and pluralism, the way in which it's one voice or multiple voices. I think that food practices get to the heart of that. When I teach on American Judaism, for example, the debates among American Jews about the kosher laws, about whether to be Jewish required observing the kosher laws or not, and in what ways it's an impediment to follow the kosher laws, the food laws in America. The way in which food gets at the heart of personal identity and practice, and then inserts you into these broader conversations, is I think says something broader about American religion. Ultimately, food is something we do every day, and so I think that's why I've always valued looking at it, because it is something which we have to do. And I think that, again, it's a lens to thinking about these bigger questions about individual practice and community identity, and the relationship between what I'm doing versus what you're doing versus what people around us are doing, and the influences and the people who are telling us that we should be doing different things. Right.
Okay. Thank you. Final word. We have been talking with Benjamin Zeller, Associate Professor of Religion at Lake Forest College and author of the chapter Quasi-Religious American Foodways, The Cases of Vegetarianism and Locavorism, in the edited book Religion, Food, and Eating in North America. At the conclusion of this episode, we trust that listeners understand a little bit more about what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, and have a deeper appreciation of religious freedom as a governing principle in the United States, and seeing to its protection as an indispensable part of the fragile American experiment in self-government. I would like to remind our listeners to go to storyofamericanreligion.org and navigate to the Sign Up tab to register for future podcast notifications. Ben, thank you so much for being with us and doing the hard work of researching and writing a chapter in a book that helps us all understand America better. It's been super enlightening for me and I think our listeners, and I hope you've enjoyed the time as well.
I really have. It's a pleasure to talk about it. Thanks so much for having me.
The podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released on the first and third Mondays of each month on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Register for notifications on our website, www.storyofamericanreligion.org, under the Sign Up tab.